Have you lost your button? Well, go find it because I'm about to show you how to sew it on by sewing machine. And if you can't find your button, well, it's very possible that there's one hiding inside of your shirt. On this shirt, you can see the last button, and then there's this stitching, and there you go, an extra button sewn into the shirt. Here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that each one of your buttons has the exact same spacing in between, or can use the same stitch width to sew them on? That's because industrial sewing machines are used and they don't have the ability to just change the width on the machine. It's set for a 3.5 millimeter spacing. So when the button's bigger, it has a bigger hole. And when the button is smaller, it has a smaller hole. If the button is a smaller hole, well, you better use a smaller needle because the needle is going to take up some of the space. And then the more thread you put in there, the thicker the thread, the needle starts to bend. Of course, if you have a custom-made button, that may not be true. So always check by measuring the distance between the two holes. And what you want to do is you want to measure halfway between the hole, not the distance of the actual button spacing, but halfway in between the holes. And that is a good rule of thumb for the measuring of how wide your zigzag stitch should be for sewing on your buttons. You may have seen videos where they show you to sew over a pin or wire to add space between the button and the material. But remember, not all fabrics are the same thickness. You shouldn't use a wire or a pin that is thicker than the material that's going to be sliding beneath the button, or you'll end up with something like this. That is much thicker than the actual shirt. What happens if you sew your button with too large of a pin beneath it is the fabric then can shift and you end up with a sloppy looking front of your shirt. And we don't want that. This shirt was sewn originally with too much thread allowed. So I sewed with my sewing machine all the way down the front of the lapel and locked the shirt closed so I didn't have to worry about a sloppy front. Have you ever wondered why buttons fall off shirts so often? It's because many industrial machines do not have a bobbin in the machine. They have what you call a chain stitch that sews the buttons on. And if one thread breaks, well, it just unravels and your button falls off. With a regular sewing machine, because you have a bobbin and a needle thread, you have a lock stitch machine and your buttons are far less likely to fall off. If you have a button fall off a blouse, well, look, and if you can just pull the thread and one of the other buttons falls off, you can actually sew all your buttons back on with your regular machine and know that you're not going to have your buttons falling off at the inopportune moment. You may have a button sewing foot that actually holds the button for you. And while in theory, this seems like a really good idea because you can slide your button in like that and it holds it, you still have to know where to place the button on the actual garment. We're not just sewing buttons randomly around, are we? If you don't know where your button should be placed because the holes on the fabric are not clear or showing where the actual stitch was sewn before, you can close the buttons up on top and bottom of that particular button, place a pin through, and then see that it's centered in your buttonhole and then pull that off. And now you know where to place your next button. Next, I use my liquid-based basting glue and I'm going to dab a little bit on the back side of the button and just dab a little on the back side of the button, spread it out a little bit, put it over the pin. Line it up so that the holes of the button are going the same direction as the other buttons. And we're going to wait for that to dry. This gives you time to measure the distance the button is away from up there, and you can shift it and then you push down gently on it and it holds that button in place for you. Another option to hold your button down is to tape over the button. However, you shouldn't sew through like Scotch tape or regular tape. Use washi tape instead and do 2 pieces, one on one side of the buttonholes and another strip on the other side of the buttonholes. And now that button is held in place and ready for you to stitch in between the holes. Now to set up the sewing machine. First, we're going to go ahead and select a zigzag stitch, a width of 3.5 millimeters wide. Of course, you want to confirm that by measuring the distance between the holes in your button, just in case that button was not made to the factory settings for industrial machines. Stitch length, even though we're going to drop the feed dogs, we're going to go ahead and lower it all the way to 0. This is a safeguard just in case your machine doesn't have the feed dogs drop all the way down. I'm going to push to drop my feed dogs. The feed dogs are these little teeth that pull the fabric through as you're sewing. So when we push the button, we drop them, and they drop beneath the throat plate of the machine and make it so your button won't advance and then be struck by the sewing machine needle when you go through the holes. And then I have found that a lot of button feet actually make the button tip up. So I prefer to not use the button foot, but just to use the snap-on adapter part of the machine if you have a machine that has snap-on feet. But this machine doesn't really bring the foot all the way down. It thinks I'm going to use a free motion foot, so it's really not holding on to the button. On buttons where you need the wire, my Satinedge foot, if you already have it, has a little wire that's connected to this guide. You go ahead and put that on to the machine. And then when you put the foot down, the button doesn't lift up because it's got more holding the button down. And you have the wire, so you don't have to insert a pin in there in order to make a button with a shank on it. Next, we're going to bring the needle into one of the holes of the bobbin by turning the handle always toward you. Make sure the needle is all the way up, and then pull and bring your bobbin thread up through the button. This allows you to later on pull both needle and bobbin thread back through the button and tie off to the back for the most secure knot possible. Knowing which needle position your machine is in, either the left or the right swing of the zigzag stitch, helps as well. Bring your needle down, and then you know now that's swinging into the right, so you bring it down in the right hole of the button and then lower the presser foot. Go ahead and double check to make sure it clears the left hole as well, and then begin sewing. And this machine thinks it's got a darning foot on, so I'm just going to hold my fabric just in case it wants to shift on me, since I don't intend to break a needle. So you just keep sewing. I did 12 stitches, but I'm using a really thin thread, so I would recommend 6 stitches would probably be adequate for that particular button. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a lock stitch on my machine, which ties, just kind of sits in the same spot. Instead of swinging left and right, it goes only in one hole. And I'm going to go back over to the other, and I'm going to do the same thing on the right hole. This is another way of tying off, so I don't have to worry about using a hand needle later. We're going to go ahead now and pull forward and do the next button, and you can see here how the thread is actually raised because it's stitched over the pin on the foot. Checking to make sure it clears both left and right of the hole again, and repeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That should be enough with a thicker thread. And then tie a knot. Remove the tape. And if you didn't have a lock stitch, you could just take these 2 threads through a hand needle, bring it right through to the back side and tie it off. But with this machine, and this is partly why we buy newer machines, we don't have to worry about that. So we can actually cut and not worry about your bobbin falling off. And because of the wire on the Satinedge foot lifting the thread up as you pull the bobbin, you'll see it has a nice little space between it so it can fit the next thicker fabric that has to be placed beneath it. I hope you enjoyed learning how to sew a button back on. For more tutorial videos like this, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And also, I have a free online school where you can reach out and ask questions and suggest different videos for me to create for you at create.clarerowley.com. I hope to see you soon in my school. Thanks for watching. Bye.